The night he left, it was raining. I was curled up in the corner of the couch, holding a letter that didn't even deserve the dignity of ink. A printed page. Cold, sterile words. This isn't working anymore. You'll be better off without me. No signature. Just his initials, like I was some stranger he was firing. No apology. No mention of the miscarriage I had suffered alone 2 weeks earlier. Just silence. Then abandonment. I had thought that was the lowest moment of my life, until 3 days later when he uploaded a smiling photo with her. The woman he once claimed was just a friend. She wore my necklace. They stood outside our vacation home. And the caption? New beginnings. The comments were filled with hearts. And I realized I wasn't mourning a man. I was mourning the version of myself who thought he would protect. Me, they said I was cold, that I drove him away, that I worked too much, loved too quietly, grieved too long, that I couldn't give him a child, so of course he looked elsewhere. The whispers grew louder than the truth. Even my own family asked if I had pushed him into someone else's arms. They didn't know I had begged him to go to therapy, with me. That I had sat in the ER, bleeding and alone, while he was at dinner with her. That I had stitched myself back together quietly every time he failed to show up. But none of that mattered. In their eyes, he was charming. I was distant. He was the golden boy, I was the bitter wife, and no one knew the truth except me. And the silence that wrapped itself around my heart and refused to let go. 2 weeks later, I collapsed on the subway platform. My body had finally surrendered. The stress, the grief, the betrayal. I woke, up in a hospital bed, IV in my arm, alone. But something was wrong. The date on the whiteboard was March 17th. My last memory had been in June. The nurse walked in. I grabbed my phone. It confirmed it. It was 3 months before he left me, before the miscarriage, before the divorce. I blinked, sat upright. Was this a coma dream? A hallucination? But everything was real. The nurse smiled. Your vitals are stabilizing now. You gave us quite the scare. I wasn't scared anymore. I was awake, really awake, for the first time in years. Somehow, fate had pressed rewind. And if I had even one breath left in this borrowed timeline, I would not waste it mourning. A man who taught me how to vanish. I went home that night to the same apartment he would one day walk out of. But I wasn't the same woman anymore. I didn't sob into the pillows. I didn't beg for his attention. I sat calmly at the dining table and opened a notebook. Page 1. What I gave him. What I'll never give again. I made a list. Loyalty. Forgiveness. Silence. Unpaid labor. Second chances. I circled the last one 3 times. Then I opened our shared bank account, transferred what was legally mine to a separate account, and quietly removed myself from any liability. He was still sweet to me, still pretending to be the husband I once adored. But I saw it now. The long hours, the secret phone, the growing coldness in his smile. The betrayal hadn't happened yet, but I wouldn't stop it. I would simply be ready when it did. For the next few days, I played the role of a devoted wife. I packed his lunch. I kissed his cheek. I asked about his day with gentle curiosity. He thought I was softening, that I was finally becoming the version of me he could mold. But I wasn't softening. I was studying, watching, memorizing his tells, when he lied, when he deflected, when he turned guilt into manipulation. I matched his performance with precision. And while he smiled at me with that perfect grin I used to fall for, I was busy, building a fortress. I opened a shell company in my name, reached out to a financial advisor I trusted, began quietly shifting my stake in the business we co-owned. Every hour he thought I was resting, I was preparing. Not to fight him. not to beg him to stay, but to make sure that when he walked out, I wouldn't follow. He noticed the shift in me, eventually. "You've been quiet lately," he said one night. "Distant." I looked up from my tablet. "Just tired." He stepped closer, searching my face. "You're not still upset about everything, are you?" The gaslighting was almost comical. "What exactly would I be upset about?" I asked. He shrugged. "You've just been intense lately. Emotional." There it was. Emotional. The word men like him use when they want to invalidate your truth. I smiled. "Don't worry. I've been working on it." He nodded, relieved. I didn't tell him what I was working on. A private lawyer, an exit strategy, a whole new life. I wasn't trying to win him back. I was making sure he would never be able to find me once he lost me. Let him underestimate me. It would only make my final silence louder. A week later, I confirmed what I already suspected. He was still seeing her. The same girl who used to work under me at the firm, 26, all eyes and ambition. He thought I didn't notice the late-night texts, the sudden interest in cologne again. He thought he was being clever, but I was already 10 steps ahead. I paid a private investigator to collect evidence. I didn't want revenge. I wanted documentation. I wanted the truth, to have timestamps when the time came. And while he was busy feeding her dreams and lies, I was feeding myself strength. Quiet mornings with black coffee and sharper boundaries. Late nights building a future he would never be invited into. The betrayal hadn't reached its climax yet, but it would. And when it did, I wouldn't be on the floor crying. I'd be standing at the door, already packed, already done. One evening, while he showered, I stood in the closet and ran my hand along the fabric of my old dresses. The ones I used to wear to please him. Soft pastels, sweetheart necklines, dresses that said, "Pick me, keep me, love me." I bagged them all, every last one. Took them to donation the next morning and walked into a boutique I hadn't visited in years. I chose silk, structure, color. I chose me. Then I sat with a stylist and updated my look, not for him, but for the woman I had once promised I'd become. She was coming back, not because he finally saw her worth, but because I finally did. When I walked past my own reflection that afternoon, I didn't flinch. I nodded at her. "You're back now. Let's make sure he sees what he lost, right before we disappear for good." I didn't plan on meeting anyone. I just wanted freedom. But fate introduced me to Marcus at a networking gala 2 weeks later. He was tall, quiet, devastatingly intelligent. A tech investor known for avoiding the spotlight. He didn't try to impress me. He asked thoughtful questions. He remembered what I said. When I mentioned my pitch from years ago that my ex had called naive, Marcus asked to see it. He read the whole deck in silence, then said, "You were 5 years ahead of your time." I almost cried, but I didn't. I smiled. Most people didn't think so. Then most people were idiots, he said calmly. That night, he walked me to my car and said, "Let me know when you're ready to build something that's yours." I didn't know it then. But he wouldn't just be my investor. He would become the love my ex never even had the capacity to. Kinom. The more time I spent with Marcus, the clearer everything became. He never interrupted me, never minimized my voice. When I mentioned what had happened in my marriage, carefully, vaguely, he didn't ask invasive questions or offer empty pity. He just listened. "You don't owe me your story," he said, once. "But you deserve to live one where you're never silenced again." That was the moment I realized I'd never known what stability felt like. I'd only known conditional support, built on how small I could make myself. Marcus didn't ask me to shrink, he asked me to expand. And in return, I gave him the one thing I had never dared give anyone after the betrayal: my trust. Quietly, gradually. And with it, I began building a new pitch deck. Not the old one. A better one. One with his backing and my vision. This time with my name on every single slide. Meanwhile, my husband continued to play the oblivious role, still pretending to be a committed husband while sneaking out at odd hours. Still assuming I was too distracted, too soft, too slow to notice. But I wasn't watching with pain anymore. I was watching with strategy. Everything I needed was already in place, financially, legally, emotionally. The lawyer I had hired quietly updated my will, secured my assets, and drafted divorce terms that would leave him with exactly what he deserved. Nothing he didn't earn. And as for the affair, it was documented, categorized, tied to corporate misconduct thanks to company funds being used for their little getaways. The pieces were set. The man who once left me bleeding and alone was about to realize the woman he discarded wasn't broken. She was biding her time, and time was up. The betrayal came on a Thursday. A text sent to the wrong phone. He meant it for her. It landed on mine. "Can't wait to see you tonight. I'm done pretending." I stared at it for a moment, then smiled. No tears, no heartbreak. Just confirmation. I replied with one word. Noted. That evening he came home late, smelling like her perfume. He didn't even bother to lie. Just dropped his keys on the table and said, "We should talk." I nodded. "Let me guess. You found yourself." He looked surprised. "How did you—" I laughed softly. "Because this isn't the first time you've practiced this line, remember?" He blinked. "You're taking this well." "I've had time," I said, "and I've made peace with your exit, but you'll regret this one." He scoffed. "That's what people say when they don't have anything left to offer." I didn't reply. I just handed him the envelope. Inside were the papers, signed, final, already reviewed by my lawyer. Everything separated, accounts closed, shares transferred, documents attached. He flipped through them, his face growing paler. "Wait, this... You can't... How did you..." "While you were busy cheating," I said gently. "I was busy preparing." His jaw clenched. "You planned this?" "No," I said. "You did. I just listened." He laughed bitterly. "You think this makes you strong?" "No," said, standing. "It makes me free." That night, he left in silence. No bags packed, no words of love, just footsteps and a closing door. And I didn't collapse. I didn't cry. I walked to my room, lit a candle, and sent Marcus a single message. "I'm ready." 2 minutes. Later, he replied, "So am I." The next few months were a blur of progress and peace. Marcus and I built something that took off faster than either of us expected. The startup became a media darling, the female-led disruptor no one saw coming. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't being compared to anyone else. My name stood on its own. I'd walk into meetings and people would shake my hand with respect, not pity. I wasn't the woman he left. I was the woman who rose without him. And Marcus? He never tried to dim me. He stood beside me, not in front. One night, after closing our first international deal, he looked at me across the hotel balcony and said, "If I ever forget how lucky I am to stand beside you, remind me." I leaned in, kissed his cheek, and whispered, "You haven't forgotten, and that's why you're here." My ex tried to reach out twice, once through a mutual friend, once through a letter. Both were ignored. I didn't need his closure. I didn't need his explanation. The silence I gave him now wasn't revenge. It was boundary. I had nothing to say, because he had already said everything I needed to hear when he walked away without looking back. As for her, She faded from public view once people realized she had nothing of her own to offer. Being the new woman loses its sparkle when there's no legacy to feed off. They bounced between rented condos, Instagram-worthy cafes, and empty, hollow captions. I didn't check on them. Others sent me updates. I didn't reply, because I wasn't in their story anymore. I had my own. And this time, the plot didn't revolve around their apologies. It revolved around my choices. Eventually, Marcus asked me to move in. He didn't rush it. He didn't pressure. He just left a key on the counter one morning and said, "When you're ready." I moved in 2 weeks later. The home was quiet, modern, filled with light and books and peace. There was no tension. No waiting up for someone who wouldn't come. Home. Just consistency. The kind that doesn't make noise but never disappears. One evening, I stood at the window, sipping tea, when he walked up behind me. "You know," he said, "you've been carrying so much weight for so long. You don't have to anymore." I turned to him, tears in my eyes. Not from pain, but from relief. "I know," I whispered. "But it's strange learning how to walk without armor." He took my hand. "You don't need armor here. You've already won." Then, one afternoon, just like that, he came back. I opened the door, expecting a delivery, and there he was. My ex, looking thinner, weathered, wearing a forced smile and standing beside her. She looked uncomfortable, dressed for a photo shoot. He looked like a man clinging to a hope he couldn't afford. "We were in the area," he said awkwardly. "Thought we'd say hi." I didn't blink, didn't flinch, just stood still as the silence wrapped around all of us. Then Marcus appeared behind me, arm resting gently on my waist. "Everything okay, love?" he asked. I turned, smiled up at him. "Just someone who forgot this chapter is over." My ex paled. She turned away. And I closed the door slowly without a word, because they didn't deserve a performance. They deserved the quiet. The moment I closed the door, I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel triumph. I felt nothing. And that nothing was everything. Because once upon a time, I would have begged for his eyes to see me, for her to acknowledge the harm she caused, for closure wrapped in an apology. But now, they could barely stand the sight of the woman I'd become. That was enough. Marcus wrapped his arms around me from behind. "Was that him?" he asked, though he already knew. I nodded. "Do you want to talk about it?" he added. "No," I said quietly. I already said everything I needed to when I chose not to say a word. We spent the rest of the evening in peace. No gossip, no gloating, just soft music and long glances, because the best revenge was never chaos. It was a life so full, it left no room for what used to break me. A week later, the proposal came, not in some grand spectacle, but in the quiet comfort of our shared world. We were walking through a vineyard he'd taken me to during our first business retreat. I was rambling about grape varieties when I turned and found him holding a ring. No speech, no kneeling, just steady eyes and a simple question. "Will you build the rest of this life with me?" And I knew then, this wasn't about replacing what I'd lost. It was about honoring what I'd become. I said yes without hesitation, not because I needed a ring to feel whole, but because I finally understood I could say yes without giving up any part of myself. Marcus wasn't offering to complete me. He was offering to match me. And that, after everything, was the only kind of love I would ever accept again. Word of our engagement spread fast. Social media took notice, especially since I was no longer his ex-wife, but the founder of a wildly successful tech platform. Women reached out in droves, sharing their own stories of betrayal and rebirth. I wasn't famous. I was proof. Proof that you could survive the storm without setting fire to everything. That you could rebuild without needing to see them burn. I was invited to conferences, featured in magazines. A headline read, "She was abandoned. Now she's the one he can't reach." I didn't comment. I didn't post a cryptic caption. I just kept building. Because my focus wasn't on being seen anymore. It was on seeing myself clearly and never letting that vision blur again. That was my real engagement. Not to a man, but to the version of me who refused to stay buried beneath someone else's ego. My wedding was held in a glass house overlooking the coast, small, intentional, and filled with light. There were no exes invited, no pity speeches, just people who had held my hand when I couldn't hold myself. Marcus stood at the altar, looking at me like I was both the answer and the question he never thought he'd get to ask. I walked down the aisle in a gown I chose not for its trendiness, but for how it made me feel. Powerful, feminine, untouchable. And when I said I do, it wasn't just to him. It was to myself, to my future, to the promise that I would never again silence my own voice for someone else's comfort. The vows were simple. The moment was profound. And somewhere far away, I knew my past self was watching, finally exhaling. My ex sent a gift, a silver frame. No note, just a blank placeholder inside. I understood what it meant. An olive branch without roots. I didn't return it. I didn't acknowledge it. I just placed it in a donation box. Because closure doesn't arrive in pretty wrapping. It arrives when you no longer need to open the door. He had chosen someone else, and I had chosen myself. That was the exchange, and I never wanted a refund. As for her, she made her profile private not long after. Someone told me she'd started seeing another man, another fixer-upper, another hollow throne. I didn't care, because my happiness didn't require their failure. It just required my freedom. And I had earned every inch of it. On our honeymoon, Marcus and I sat on a rooftop in Florence, sipping wine under soft lights. He brushed my hair behind my ear and said, "You know, I read that article about you last year, the one about how you rose from betrayal." I laughed. I hated that title. "Why?" he asked. Because it made it sound like he was the story. And he wasn't. He nodded slowly. Then what was? I looked around. The sunset, the peace, the way I felt in my skin. "This," I said. "This is the story. The part they never thought I'd reach." He smiled. "Then let's keep writing it." And in that moment, I understood. Survival was just the first chapter. Flourishing, that was the legacy. Back home, my company continued to thrive. We launched a mentorship program for women rebuilding after loss, career, divorce, identity. I personally mentored 10 women that year, each one carrying a story that mirrored a piece of mine. One said, "I thought I had to be strong for him. Now I'm learning to be strong for me." That sentence echoed in my heart for days. Because that was it. That was what I had been building all along. Not a business, not revenge, but a space where women no longer had to beg to be heard. Where our silence wasn't mistaken for weakness, and our strength wasn't weaponized against us. My success wasn't just my own. It was shared, multiplied, and more powerful than anything he or she had ever tried to take. One day, I received a letter, anonymous, but unmistakably his handwriting. I was wrong, about everything, especially you. I folded it once, placed it in a drawer, and never looked at it again, because healing doesn't mean reopening wounds. It means knowing you could, and choosing not to. My forgiveness wasn't written. It was lived. In the life I chose every day. In the peace I kept. In the way I no longer looked for his name in rooms that once revolved around him. He had once been my whole world. Now, he wasn't even on the map. And that wasn't bitterness. It was grace. The kind that only comes when you stop chasing the ending you thought you needed, and write the one you deserve instead. I gave my first keynote a year after the wedding. The theme wasn't revenge or recovery. It was rebirth. I stood on a stage lit with quiet gold and soft shadows and told a room full of women, "You are not the chapters they wrote for you. You are the story they didn't have the range to imagine." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was emotional, steady, knowing, because they understood. They had sat in silence too, bitten their tongues to survive, been called dramatic for reacting, and cold when they didn't. And I was standing there as proof that the woman you become after betrayal doesn't have to be hardened. She can be healed, empowered, radiant. Not because she was saved, but because she stopped waiting for someone to do the saving. That was the shift that rewrote everything. I didn't rise in spite of him. I rose when I stopped shrinking around him. After the speech, a young woman approached me. "I followed your story," she said. "When he came back with her and you, answered the door with someone better, something in me healed." I reached for her hand. "It wasn't about him," I said. "It was about me finally choosing someone who didn't ask me to disappear to be loved." She teared up. "I left mine yesterday. Your story gave me the courage. That moment anchored something in me I didn't know I needed. All this time, I thought I was rebuilding alone. But I wasn't. I was lighting a path. And even if no one had followed, I still would have walked it. But now, seeing others step forward, claim themselves, say, 'No more,' I understood. My pain wasn't wasted. It was repurposed. My silence wasn't weakness. It was just the pause before the roar. I stopped Googling him after that. Not out of restraint, but disinterest. His name no longer stirred anything in me. And when people asked, whatever happened to him, I'd smile and say, I truly wouldn't know. Because that was the power I had now. Not the need to check or explain or prove anything. Just the confidence of someone who knows she walked through fire and came out gold. I didn't need to compete with her anymore either. The Mistress, the girl who once wore my necklace. She was still posting curated moments online, still chasing visibility. I wasn't watching. My visibility wasn't borrowed. It was earned. And I didn't need likes to validate it. I just needed to look in the mirror and know I didn't just get through it. I turned it into something no one could ever steal again. Marcus and I bought a small coastal home. It wasn't grand or flashy, just peace carved into stone and glass. He spent mornings making coffee while I journaled. Our life was simple, intentional. There were no performance gestures, no dramatics, just two people who had chosen each other, with eyes wide open. Once, I asked him if it ever bothered him that I came from something so painful. No, he said, because I didn't fall in love with the pain. I fell in love with the woman who turned it into power. I kissed him for that. Not because it was poetic, but because it was true. He hadn't tried to fix me. He'd witnessed the fixing I did myself and respected the strength it took. That was the love story I never saw coming. And that's why it lasted. We hosted our first private retreat for women rebuilding after betrayal. Only 10 attendees. No influencers, no cameras, just raw honesty. One woman shared, I stayed because I thought I was protecting the family, but I was disappearing from it. Another said, he said I was overreacting every time I cried, so I stopped crying. And then he said I was cold. Every word mirrored pieces of my past, but this time, I didn't cry with them. I stood beside Them. Not as a savior. As a survivor who turned that survival into a launch pad. We wrote letters. We burned them. We made promises. We said names out loud we hadn't dared whisper before. And when we walked out of that weekend, we didn't just walk lighter, we walked louder, not with noise, but with truth. And that truth would echo far beyond the walls of any retreat. One afternoon, an email arrived from a publishing house. They wanted to adapt the second save into a documentary series. I hesitated. Did I want to relive it all on camera? Did I want my worst day archived in someone else's edit room? But then I thought of that woman at the retreat. Of the girl who once stood alone in her living room, holding divorce papers signed by a man who never apologized. And I realized it wasn't about me anymore. It was about everyone still waiting to hear you're not crazy, you're not dramatic. You were just right about people who couldn't handle your truth. So I said yes, but only under one condition. I wanted full creative control. I would not let anyone twist the narrative again. This was my story, my silence, my survival, my voice. The documentary premiered in a small theater packed with women from every walk of life. No celebrities, no press releases, just real people who knew what it meant to be erased, doubted, and reborn. As the final credits rolled, the room was silent, not with boredom, but with something deeper. Recognition. Grief meeting grace. One woman stood and whispered, "Thank you." And suddenly the room followed, not clapping, just nodding. A collective exhale. I didn't cry. I smiled, softly, because this time the narrative wasn't his anymore. It was mine. Curated by my memory, protected by my voice, and backed by every moment I refused to stay down. That night, I received hundreds of letters, most not about love lost, but about selves found. And that was the true story all along, not of heartbreak, but of reclamation. Months passed. The world kept spinning, but my world had finally stilled. I slept deeply. I laughed freely. I danced in the kitchen again. One morning, Marcus found me twirling barefoot across the hardwood. "What's the occasion?" he asked. I shrugged. "I don't need one." That was the life I had dreamed of, where joy didn't require a reason, and peace wasn't borrowed from someone else's validation. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of being abandoned, not of being overlooked. Because I had proven something most people never get the chance to, that being discarded is not the end. It's the beginning of a story that no one else gets to write, but you. Eventually, his name faded entirely from my vocabulary. People would mention him in passing, his failed ventures, his divorce, the tabloid-worthy breakdowns, and I'd simply blink. "Oh," I'd say. I hadn't heard. And it was the truth. Because I had stopped tracking his fall when I started building my rise. That's the thing they never tell you about letting go. It doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with stillness. You realize one day that the person who haunted your nights doesn't even cross your mind at breakfast. That the person who once dictated your tears couldn't even change your expression now. And that freedom? That's the kind of quiet that shakes the world. Marcus and I celebrated our 3rd anniversary in the same place where we first met. He raised a glass to me, eyes soft. "Do you ever miss her?" he asked. "The woman I used to be." I smiled. "Sometimes, but she's still here. She just got louder, braver." He nodded. "I love every version of you. But this one leads armies." I laughed. "I'm not building an army." "No," he said, "but you are building something that no one can tear down, because it's not built on proving anything. It's built on truth." And that was the difference. My new life didn't exist because of revenge. It existed because of release. One day, I got a letter forwarded from my old firm. It was from her, the Mistress. She didn't beg. She didn't insult. She just wrote, "You were never the villain. I just didn't know how to be enough without taking something that wasn't mine. I'm sorry." I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside his. Not out of forgiveness, but out of closure. She had finally seen what I knew all along. You can't wear a crown stolen from another woman's grief. It never fits. And if she was on a journey now to find herself, I hoped she walked it honestly. But I wouldn't walk beside her. My healing didn't require her redemption. It only required my boundaries, and I'd drawn them in stone. The documentary was picked up by a global platform. I began receiving invitations to speak on stages I once watched from the sidelines, but I turned most of them down, not out of fear, but out of priority. I didn't need the world's applause to know my worth. I already had it. In the notes stuck to my mirror, in Marcus's hand over mine, in the students who sent thank you, emails after every retreat. My legacy didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be lasting. And it was. Every time a woman chose herself after years of shrinking. Every time someone walked away without explanation because she knew her silence was enough. That was the real impact. Not my story, but the ripple of stories that followed. On my 40th birthday, I walked out to our backyard, barefoot in the grass, surrounded by friends who had become family. We laughed. We drank wine. We played old music and danced like girls, who no longer feared being too much. Someone asked what I would tell my younger self. I looked up at the sky and said, "You were never too much." He was just too small. That line made its way into journals, onto bookmarks, into tattoos, and I didn't trademark it. I didn't monetize it. I just let it spread. Because the best things we create are the ones that heal others quietly. And that sentence, it wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to every woman who needed it. One final thing happened. Years after it all, I received a wedding invitation from someone I once mentored. The bride's note said, "I found someone who doesn't ask me to choose between being loved and being powerful, just like you showed me." I cried, not because I was sad, but because that sentence echoed the vow I once made at my own wedding. I get to be both now. That was my real legacy. Not the company, not the book, not the interviews, but the women who now lived, unapologetically, who no longer asked for permission to exist, who opened the door to the past, not to invite it in, but to tell it, "You no longer live here." And so, here's how the story ends. Or maybe, how it continues. He returned with his mistress, thinking I'd still be waiting. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I answered the door wearing peace-like perfume, and beside me stood the man who loved me without conditions. Not because I needed saving, but because I'd already saved myself. He saw it all then. Everything he gave up. Everything I built. Everything he could never touch again. And when he walked away that day, empty-handed and stunned, I didn't say a word, because I no longer needed to prove anything. I was the proof, whole, reborn, and completely beyond his reach.